Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on heart health nutrition. My name is Ashley Hayslip and I'm one of the registered dietitians here at Food and Friends, and thanks for being here today. So today's webinar is scheduled to last for 1 hour, and that's including time for questions. And I just want to remind everyone that today's info is really for general nutrition education. And, everyone's nutrition and their health is unique. So any specific questions I can't really answer today, but feel free to give your dietitian a call or always consult with your doctor if it's something very specific. But we can address, pretty general questions right now. And then after the webinar, we're going to be sending out a link to a survey, and we would really appreciate it if you're able to spend a few minutes just filling that out to give us a little more feedback on what you liked and what you'd like to see in the future. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so today's topic is discussing nutrition for heart health, but what is that really referring to? So the heart is a part of the cardiovascular system, which also includes blood vessels throughout the body. And the heart is responsible for pumping blood throughout our body and delivers oxygen and other nutrients to all the cells in our body and allows our organs to function properly. It also is responsible for helping get rid of waste products in the blood and byproducts of our metabolism. So things like carbon dioxide. So these are its main functions. And so why is heart health important? So heart health, is central to overall good health, and cardiovascular disease or heart disease is a catch-all term for many different heart conditions. People with heart disease are at a higher risk for heart attacks and stroke. And unfortunately, heart disease is very common, and it's the leading cause of death in the US. Almost half of all Americans have been diagnosed with some form of heart disease. And what's even a tougher statistic is it's estimated that 80% of all of the deaths from stroke and heart attacks are preventable through lifestyle changes. Okay, so markers of heart health. So what do we need to know when it comes to our cardiovascular health? So getting regular checkups and staying in touch with your primary care provider is really important. The first step to knowing how your heart's doing and your health is knowing your numbers. So that can include labs that can tell us a little bit about our heart health and things like our blood pressure. And staying informed on these things is, the first key to prevention. If you have any of these risk factors, it's even more important to get screened for heart disease just because it can help find some early signs. So things like being 50 years or older, having a family history of heart disease or stroke, obesity, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, and smoking. These are all things that, if some of this runs in your family, you have some of these risk factors, it's really important to kind of get your blood work done and talk with your doctor. So there's a lot of tests your doctor can order to check for your heart health and your risk of heart disease. But we're going to focus on 3 risk factors that nutrition can have a big impact on. So those are blood pressure, cholesterol levels, and triglyceride levels. Okay, so blood pressure. So this is an really important indicator of our heart health. The heart pumps blood through our arteries, which are those vessels that carry the oxygen and other nutrients. And so there's an image showing blood flowing through an artery, and there's some pressure put on the walls of the artery. And so this pressure is what we are referring to when we talk about blood pressure. Another way to define blood pressure is that it's the measure of force that your heart uses to pump blood. So it's basically an indicator of how hard your heart has to work to pump blood. And your blood pressure is measured in 2 numbers. So there's a top number called the systolic pressure, which is, how much pressure your blood is exerting against your artery walls when your heart is actually pumping. And then the second number is diastolic blood pressure, and that's the pressure of your that's the pressure in between heartbeats. So a combination of 2 gives us our blood pressure. And although you may not feel any different, when your blood pressure is high, your heart has to work a lot harder. So if it's untreated or you don't know that you have high blood pressure, this can put extra strain on your heart, and it can put you in a higher risk for heart disease and other problems like vision loss or kidney disease. So, you know, the fact that high blood pressure doesn't really have any symptoms or, you know, signs, it's really important to check it regularly and have a good idea of what your blood pressure is. And then, so there's a lot of risk factors that can increase someone's risk of developing high blood pressure. And a lot of those factors are difficult to modify, you know, meaning we don't really have a lot of control over them, like our family history. But it doesn't mean that you're going to have high blood pressure. It just means you're at a higher risk. So some of those factors include, like I said, the family history, certain races and ethnicities are at a higher risk, and increasing age is also a factor. Males are more likely to have high blood pressure compared to females, and chronic stress can also, you know, negatively impact blood pressure. And these things we don't have a lot of control over. But the good thing, there are a lot of factors that we do have control over. So our modifiable risk factors include cigarette smoking. So, you know, avoiding cigarettes or quitting can really help lower your risk of high blood pressure and help decrease your blood pressure. People with diabetes are at a higher risk, but keeping your blood sugar under control and well managed can help decrease your risks and side effects of high blood pressure. Having high cholesterol also increases your risk. You know, diets high in sodium or drinking excessive amounts of alcohol, those both can increase your risk of high blood pressure. And then being physically inactive also can negatively impact blood pressure. We're going to go into greater detail on sodium, cholesterol, and physical activity later on in this presentation. Okay, so cholesterol. Cholesterol is another indicator of heart health. And cholesterol is a waxy substance that's found in our bodies. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Our body actually needs cholesterol. Our body makes it to build cells and to also make different vitamins and hormones that our body needs. Our liver naturally produces all the cholesterol that we need. So, you know, our liver, if we never had any cholesterol, we would have enough just based on the amount our liver produces. But there are food sources, and those come from animal products. So meat, poultry, seafood, and dairy products all contain cholesterol. And for most people, if you eat some food with cholesterol, usually our bodies will stop making more cholesterol. But there's some people that their bodies will continue to produce cholesterol even if they're eating some. So in that case, the cholesterol can accumulate in your bloodstream. And if you have high cholesterol, you know, you're not alone. It's very common. 95 million Americans have high cholesterol. And, you know, it's something that it's really important to know your numbers. And so those sorts of numbers include all of these labs, the types of cholesterol. So the LDL stands for low density lipoprotein. And LDL is the potentially harmful type of cholesterol that can cause damage to our blood vessels if it's too high. And ideally, the desirable range for LDL is less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. So HDL stands for high density lipoprotein, and HDL acts as a scavenger in our bloodstream, and it actually helps to remove excess cholesterol that's in the blood and transports it back to the liver to be eliminated. And so the desirable range for HDL is anywhere 40 to 60 milligrams. But since HDL actually can help us reduce our LDL, it's a desirable thing, and the higher the number, the better. Total cholesterol includes a combination of different forms of cholesterol. They just kind of add them all up, and it also includes partially your triglycerides. And then that desirable range is under 200. And then the last one that you'll see on a lab test is the cholesterol ratio. And this is just our total cholesterol being divided by our HDL. And it's used to predict the risk of developing heart disease. And a higher ratio indicates a higher risk. So if your cholesterol numbers are outside of the normal range, it could be a sign that you're at a higher risk of developing heart disease. But if you do have high cholesterol, there's a few things to remember. Don't assume that it's out of your control. Genetics does play a role in our cholesterol levels. And there is a rare condition called familial hypercholesteremia, and I just call that FH for short. And with these people with this condition, you're born with just high levels of LDL, and there's not really a lot you can do to control it. And medication is definitely recommended for that condition. But I will say it's pretty rare. Only 1 in 300 people actually have FH. Other than FH, genetics and cholesterol is poorly understood. We do know that it can run in families. But another thing to think about is, we don't just inherit genes from our families, we also inherit eating habits. So that might be part of the reason why people in families tend to have high cholesterol. It could be just from certain habits or diet or lifestyle things as well. If you have high cholesterol, I just want to focus to that. You don't want to just focus on weight loss. It may not necessarily help you lower your cholesterol, especially if you're trying to lose weight quickly with certain diets like that are popular right now, like the keto diet or low carb diets. Those can actually increase your cholesterol and may not help you get to that goal of lowering your cholesterol. And then in addition to exercise, if exercise can play a role, and we'll talk about that too in a bit, but focusing on changes in your diet, especially with adding in healthier foods, can make a big impact. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few slides about what foods can help lower cholesterol. And triglycerides, so this is the other marker we're looking at, and triglycerides are the most common type of fat found in our body. And what they do is they help store extra calories or energy from our diet. So when you eat, your body converts any calories it doesn't need to use right away into triglycerides, and they're stored in your fat cells to be used later. So later on in between meals, some hormones will come and help release those triglycerides in order to release some energy for us to use up in our body. And I'll say having high triglycerides is also pretty common. 1 in 5 Americans have high triglycerides. And so checking your triglyceride levels is another one of those important numbers to be aware of when it comes to heart health. So if you're regularly eating more calories than you burn, particularly from foods with a lot of added sugars, you might have high triglycerides from that. And high triglycerides, if combined with high LDL cholesterol, can increase your risk of stroke, heart attacks, and heart disease. So it's an important number to be aware of. And many of the same recommendations for lowering cholesterol will also help with triglycerides. Like we mentioned a little bit, the exercise can especially be helpful with triglycerides because it can help you burn off extra calories that won't be needed to be stored with the help of the triglycerides. And then also reducing your intake of sugary foods or foods with a lot of added sugars can help reduce triglycerides as well. So now we'll talk a little more about some of the lifestyle tips and nutrition that can help with these things. So when it comes to simple lifestyle changes, so we don't need to, we can avoid high heart disease, but also if you have heart disease, doing these things can at least help slow it down or even, reduce any side effects or complications. Like the physical activity, adding that into your week can have a really positive impact on blood pressure, cholesterol, and triglyceride levels. And so what do we consider regular physical activity? So that is just some form of movement that increases your heart rate for 150 minutes for the week. So that sounds like a lot, but if you break that down, that's about 30 minutes most days of the week. So 5 days a week doing 30 minutes. And it doesn't have to be anything very extreme or intense. Even just walking or gardening or finding an activity you enjoy can really have a positive impact. Not smoking is one of the best things you can do for your heart health, and limiting alcohol to no more than 1 serving per day can also be important. That's for females. Males, it's 2 servings, but keeping that number down can help with cholesterol and blood pressure. And then, so what is a serving of alcohol? This is an important one because there is a standard for those, and 1 serving of alcohol equals 12 ounces of beer. That could be 8 or 9 ounces of malt liquor, 5 ounces of wine, or 1.5 ounces of distilled spirits. So any more than that is going to be make it a little harder to maintain heart health. If you have diabetes, keeping your blood sugar well managed can also help reduce the risk of developing heart disease. And then the part we're going to focus on most now is, the eating healthy part. So we're going to focus on sodium, saturated fat, and soluble fiber. Okay, so sodium. So reducing sodium in your diet is a really important step in lowering your blood pressure specifically. Sodium is a mineral found naturally in food, and our body does actually need some, but most people get too much. And, if we have too much sodium in the diet, it can be hard on our health and it can increase blood pressure. Most people, we eat way more than we actually need. And the reason it can be detrimental to our blood pressure is sodium attracts water in the body. So when someone has a high sodium diet, the sodium's pulling water into the bloodstream. And this causes the volume of your blood to increase, which will result in higher blood pressure. And it means that your heart just has to work harder to pump all that blood. Even reducing your sodium intake by a small amount can decrease your blood pressure by 5 to 6 points. So just reducing it can have a big impact. And there's, it depends on the individual how much sodium they really need to cut out or how much they need in a day. But generally, it's recommended around 1,500 to 2,300 milligrams or less. And the average American eats about 3,400 milligrams. So it's something we probably all can work on watching and reducing a little bit. In addition to table salt, most of our sodium comes from processed foods. And there are certain foods that tend to be very high in sodium, and they're known as the salty six. And about 40% of the sodium consumed by Americans comes from the following foods. So breads and rolls. Although a slice of bread may not have that much sodium, combined with, if you have a sandwich with 2 slices or more than a couple slices in a day, that can really add up, especially certain brands of bread can have very high sodium. So that's just something to look at on the nutrition facts label. Deli meats and other processed meats like hot dogs and bacon, those are really high in sodium. Just, 6 thin slices of deli meat can have almost a half of your daily amount of sodium. And then pizza is one of the salty six, with toppings like cheese and pepperoni, along with the crust. 1 slice can contribute to half of your sodium needs for the entire day. And then poultry's on here, and poultry sodium content can really vary depending on how it's prepared. But this is mostly referring to like pre-made, store-bought chicken, or restaurants or fast food chicken like wings or breaded drumsticks, because those tend to be very high in sodium. And then canned soup also usually has about half of your daily sodium intake in just 1 cup. So if you're buying pre-made soup, look for low sodium options. And then the last of the salty six is sandwiches. So they are considered to add a lot of sodium, and that kind of makes sense if you think about that they usually contain bread, cheese, deli meats, condiments, all those things. The sodium is going to add up. Okay, so reducing sodium intake. So as you're working to get your taste buds used to less salt, it's still possible to still prepare delicious food at home without adding extra salt. And one way to bring out flavor is adding acids to foods. So acids act like salt in the fact that they bring out natural flavors, and they can actually add a brightness to food. So things like lemon juice, red wine vinegar, apple cider vinegar, they can be added to recipes in the cooking process, or they can be added in at the end, kind of like you would do if some people add like a finishing salt. You can do the same thing, but with a vinegar or an acid, and that can help bring out more flavors and brighten the dish. As we saw with the salty six, most dietary sodium comes from eating packaged and prepared foods, not from the table salt added to food when eating or cooking. So it's important to read the nutrition facts label on a package and to compare the amount of sodium. But in general, foods with more than 300 milligrams of sodium might be too high, depending on what you're looking at and what else you're eating with that food. And it's always best to try to choose the lower sodium options when possible. And also, while looking at nutrition facts labels, it's important to remember to look at the serving size, because you might be eating more than what the serving size says or less. If you're interested in learning what an appropriate amount of sodium is, or learning more about reading nutrition facts, just give your Food and Friends dietitian a call, and they can talk to you about that. Okay, so we're going to move on to saturated fats. And saturated fats are a type of fat found in animal-based foods like beef, pork, chicken with the skin, dairy like cheese and butter, and also in tropical oils like coconut and palm oil. They're also sometimes called solid fats, since they tend to be solid at room temperature. So eating too much saturated fat can raise our LDL cholesterol, which will increase our risk of heart disease. And I did want to make a note too that the amount of saturated fat will vary depending on the type of food or the cut of meat, for example. So a steak's going to have less saturated fat than ground beef. Skinless chicken breasts will have less saturated fat than chicken wings, especially if there's skin on the chicken. And then like whole milk will have more saturated fat than low fat milk. And here are just some examples of foods high in saturated fats on the left-hand side. So things like coconut oil, palm oil, butter, heavy cream, etc. These should be eaten in moderation to keep your saturated fat intake on the lower end. On the right-hand side of the screen are examples of heart-healthy fats, such as peanut butter, tree nuts like almonds and walnuts, olive and canola oil, and so on. And there's been a lot of studies that have shown that swapping out a saturated fat for a heart-healthy fat can lower cholesterol levels. So instead of having butter on your toast every morning, try swapping the butter for a heart-healthier fat like peanut butter. So just little things like that, or choosing the chicken breast over the chicken drumstick, and avoiding eating the skin and things like that can really cut down on your saturated fat as well. The American Heart Association recommends aiming, for about 5 to 6% of calories coming from saturated fat. So that means if you're eating about 2,000 calories a day, that would be about 120 of those would come from saturated fat, which is about 13 grams. But even without having to focus on grams and specific amounts, just working to eat less of the foods high in saturated fats, and then especially replacing them with the healthier options, will really make a difference when it comes to your cholesterol levels and heart health. And I do want to say that I know a lot of those foods on the left-hand side that have a lot of saturated fat, those can be still part of your diet. You don't have to avoid them completely. It's just more about looking at the bigger picture and thinking about what else you're eating in that meal, what you're having the rest of the day. And it's just saturated fats are one piece of the puzzle. It doesn't mean you can't ever have them. It's just finding ways to make them work in your daily intake, weekly, or finding ways to make them fit. Okay, so soluble fiber. So the last nutrient we're covering today is soluble fiber. And I wanted to end the webinar with this because it's something that we all can benefit from eating more of, and not something we have to worry about limiting or reducing. So fiber is made of both insoluble and soluble fiber, and together they're really important for our health. So fiber is found in plants, and our bodies can't fully break down or digest them. And the soluble fiber in food in particular can help bring down cholesterol and triglyceride levels. So even if you didn't eat any saturated fat ever, if you don't have any soluble fiber, it'll be hard to bring down cholesterol and triglyceride levels alone. And the reason that soluble fiber can help bring down the cholesterol and triglycerides is because when we consume it, it dissolves and creates sort of a gel in our digestive tract. And once it reaches our small intestine, it binds to cholesterol and other fats like triglycerides and prevents them from being reabsorbed into the bloodstream. So instead of them being reabsorbed by our body, it's bound to the soluble fiber in our GI tract, and moves through our GI tract with that and gets eliminated. So we never actually absorb it or reabsorb it. Also, what's nice about soluble fiber, in addition to its heart health qualities, it also can help stabilize blood sugar after a meal and can help you feel fuller for longer after eating. So a lot of good benefits to soluble fiber. And any foods high in fiber in general will contain soluble fiber. You know, all whole grains, beans, vegetables, fruits and nuts and seeds, these are all going to be good choices for getting more fiber in your diet. I've just listed some items here that are particularly high in soluble fiber specifically. And I wanted to highlight too from this list, if you can see that a lot of the best sources are oats and barley and lentils and beans. So those all really pack a punch when it comes to soluble fiber. And adding these foods into your day can make a big impact on meeting your soluble fiber goal and lowering cholesterol and triglycerides. And I think it's also worth noting, I mentioned earlier about the weight loss and low carb diets. One of the tough things with a low carb diet is it's a lot harder to meet your soluble or your fiber goals in general, since so many complex carbs like the whole grains, the beans, the potatoes, and fruit, they contain a lot of carbs, but they also contain a lot of fiber, and there's a lot of health benefits to eating those foods more often. And then, so soluble fiber, how much should we be aiming to get in a day? So it's recommended for fiber in general to get about 25 grams for women and 38 grams for men. And I'll say that most Americans do not meet this recommendation. On average, Americans eat about 10 to 15 grams of fiber per day. If you're currently not eating a lot of fiber on a regular basis and want to start doing so, it's best to gradually add in more slowly. And as you do this, you want to make sure you're drinking enough water, because if you're not drinking enough water and increasing your fiber intake, it might make it increase your risk of getting some constipation. So making sure you're well hydrated and gradually increasing the amount can be beneficial. And then there's a note too about soluble fiber is, it's always best to try to get your fiber from food sources. If you're having trouble meeting your goals, a fiber supplement like psyllium husk powder might be helpful as well. But it's always helpful to start with whole foods, since there's other health benefits to those things in addition to the fiber. So if you want help adding more soluble fiber into your diet, feel free to reach out to your Food and Friends dietitian for tips as well. Okay, so that's all I have. Thank you everyone for listening. I want to see if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for sharing all of this awesome information with all of our attendees. And we've had a pretty active comments and questions in the chat box. So I'll start sharing especially some of the questions for Ashley to answer for us. And yeah, feel free to keep the questions and comments coming in the chat and or the Q&A box. So one question that I wanted to ask Ashley that was shared by Maria is, how many whole eggs can a person consume in a week in order to avoid cholesterol?
That's a really good question. I actually didn't mention that in my presentation. I should have. So the thing with eggs is, you're right, they do contain a lot of cholesterol. But what we're finding for most people, and it depends on your individual situation, but for most people, our bodies, turn off our livers will stop producing more cholesterol if we're eating something with cholesterol. So it kind of balances out. If that's not the case, or you do have the FH, the genetic component, that might be a different story. But in general, we know that cholesterol isn't really the concern when it comes to foods. It's more so the saturated fat. So eggs and things like shrimp that are also pretty high in cholesterol, they're really low in saturated fat. So they're okay to have, and they're good sources of protein. I think there's been some studies about eggs, and I know it's gone back and forth a lot, but I think in general, it's safe to say a yolk a day is fine. So if you had an egg a day, that would be completely fine. But yeah, it's mostly the saturated fat you want to be looking at, and not so much the cholesterol. That's a good question though.
Awesome, thank you. Another question, this was from April. Stevia, liquid stevia, is it a good substitute for sugar?
That's a good question. I believe, I haven't really thought about that. It's better than eating foods with a lot of sugar. I will say they're very, very sweet. So I think it can be a good substitute as you're working on just decreasing, added the sweet taste as well. So I think that would be fine. I think in general, though, working on kind of not needing to add as much sugar to things is always a good, or sugar or sweetness to things is a good starting point too. But I think in the meantime, that would be fine. Yeah, it's a better choice than the added sugar itself.
Awesome. Okay, here's another great question. And yeah, I just wanted to reiterate if there's any questions we don't get to today or any further questions you have after the webinar, please, follow up with your Food and Friends dietitian. We're happy to talk further about all of this with you and support you. So here's one for vegans. What, this could apply to people who aren't vegan too, but for vegans, what plant-based foods would you recommend to raise your good cholesterol? Do vegans get all their cholesterol from their liver?
That's a good question. We don't need, it's one of those nutrients our bodies can make completely on their own. And so you don't need to worry about adding it in your diet. Your body's going to take care of it completely. When it comes to your HDL, your good cholesterol, I know that exercise is one thing that can improve your cholesterol, your HDL levels. And I'd have to look up some other items too, because it's been a minute since I've looked that up, but I don't know, Grace, if you can, what foods are good for that. I know exercise definitely is one, because it's harder to raise your HDL than it is to lower your LDL.
Yeah, maybe I can find a good resource for that and post it in the chat in a few minutes.
Exercise definitely is one that they have seen can help. And then some people will find too, I'll just note this, that if you do have high cholesterol and you're working on lowering your LDL, it is sometimes happen that your HDL will go down a little bit too. And that's okay, because really when we're looking, the ratio is important of the different types of cholesterol, but really getting the LDL is probably the first step, but it is a little harder to increase the HDL. That's a good question.
Definitely. I also see a question about, can we send the PDF of the meeting? And yes, we will send out a follow-up email after the webinar with the link to the recording as well as the slides in PDF form. So great question. And yeah, hope you'll find the information helpful to refer back to later. Here's another question. I think this is kind of a follow-up to the question about stevia. What about honey as a replacement?
That's a great question. So when it comes to honey or maple syrup or agave syrup, those are all still, I know they're not exactly, sugar cane or sugar coming from like sugar beets, but when we consume it, our body processes it just like it does regular white sugar. So, if you enjoy the taste of it or it works well in whatever you're eating for the recipe, I think that's okay. It's not, switching to that isn't going to be a healthier option than any other different type of sugar, because our body really doesn't see the difference and it's going to break it down the exact same way.
All right. Here's another question. If teeth are dentures, is it okay to steam, saute, or put apples into a smoothie? Do you get the same fiber content?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when it comes to cooking and pureeing things can break down a little bit of fiber, but the cool thing with soluble fiber is, like for apples, that it's still going to all be there. You might lose some of the insoluble fiber that's like in the skin, but generally, adding apple to a smoothie or something like that, you're going to get all the benefits, because it's different to do that than, say apple juice, where you're removing all the fiber. So, if apples are too hard to chew, there's other ways to eat them, and that's fine for the soluble fiber. And then, there's also so many other vegetable or fruits and veggies that can get you that soluble fiber too. That might be easier to chew more easily.
Awesome. I see a question here about the keto. You mentioned earlier a comment about the keto diet. Someone said, what type of people eat keto meals? Maybe if you just want to speak to that question or something else about that topic.
Yeah, so I was just referring to the keto diet as like a popular fad diet where it basically is really, really low in carbs and really high in fat. And the goal with that is really just for weight loss. And so I wanted to mention that because a lot of times you'll hear, if you have high cholesterol, you need to lose weight to lower your cholesterol, and all that's true. It can help, but really what's going to help is those behaviors, like the different types of foods you're eating and the exercise, and not so much the actual weight. So I just mentioned the keto diet as an example because it's pretty high in fat, very low in carbohydrate, and you're kind of missing out on all that soluble fiber. And you might be eating a lot more saturated fat than you would be if you were not following something like a keto diet or a low carb diet.
Gotcha. I also see a couple of questions here about like raw versus cooked foods. Someone asked to consume oatmeal raw instead of cooked. Is that better? And someone else asked about raw versus cooked beets.
Yeah. So when it comes to the oatmeal, cooking it or eating it like raw, like they're both going to be fine when it comes to your soluble fiber, because once you do eat the raw rolled oats or something, they're going to absorb some liquids in your stomach and get that that gel-like consistency once you start digesting it. So when it comes to like helping with the soluble fiber for your cholesterol and your triglycerides, it doesn't matter if it's cooked or not. I think it just depends on how you're eating it. I know people will add like raw oats to smoothies or things like that, and that's completely fine, but no different from cooking it. So if you enjoy it hot, eat it cooked. If not, it's okay. When it comes to the raw meat, is that what you said, Grace?
Raw beets.
Raw meats. So like things like sushi or
oh, sorry, beets with a B as in boy.
Oh, okay. That makes more sense. So I believe that won't make a difference either. It's still going to be a healthy option if it's raw shredded beets in your salad or steamed beets or something. You're not really losing the fiber and all the health benefits from it. It's different if you're doing like a beet juice, because then you're losing all the fiber that way by removing the fiber and just having the juice portion. But as long as it's still the whole food, cooked or raw, it's okay when it comes to the soluble fiber.
That's a good point, and love a good beet salad. That sounds so good. Got so many great questions. Here's another one. Is there a difference between regular peanut butter and natural peanut butter? What's the difference?
That's a good question. So the difference between natural and say like the regular is the type of fat that they might add to the peanut butter. So you'll find peanut butters that are just peanuts, ground up peanuts, maybe a little bit of salt added. So you'll also find peanut butter that has ground peanuts, and they'll add like another oil just to help make it a little easier to like stir, because you know it can get pretty hard and spread a little easier, and that's okay. You just want to maybe read. That's a really good question, because certain fats, and I did mention this in the saturated fats. Let me go back to that. Palm oil is listed as one of the high saturated fats, and that's a common ingredient added to peanut butter. And it's really high in saturated fat. So choosing a peanut butter that hopefully if you can find one without the palm oil, or make it sure it's farther down on the ingredient list, because the farther down on the ingredient list means the less it has. But the best thing you can look at is the actual saturated fat on the food, on the nutrition facts label, and see what that says, because that's gonna, if there's palm oil in that, it'll show you the saturated fat amount will be different. And then I didn't mention this, but partially hydrogenated oil will be mentioned sometimes, and that's something to look at and try to eat less of, because that can raise your LDL and actually lower your HDL. So we don't like that. It's if you're just trying to eat it less often, or if you have other options, that's better.
Yeah, very helpful. Thanks. And kind of along those similar lines, um, someone asked, is there something wrong with the use of refined coconut oil occasionally?
That's a good question. So, an occasional use of coconut oil, I think is fine. It's just something you don't want to make it the only oil you cook with. I personally really love like coconut curry. I think it's delicious and I'm still going to eat it even though it's really high in saturated fat, but I don't have it every day. So something like a refined coconut oil, that can, if there's a certain recipe you want to use that for because it has the high smoke point or something, that's fine. But, choosing like the canola oils and olive oils, depending on what you're cooking more often, it's going to be just better for your cholesterol levels. But yeah, it doesn't
Gotcha.
mean you can't ever have these things. It's just trying to choose them not as often and more moderate and, choose the other options more often.
Yeah, emphasizing the foods you want to have in your diet more often. Um, oh, Ashley, do you have any thoughts about or comments about different kinds of salt, like pink or black salt?
That's such a good question. I was going to talk about this too, but I didn't add it into the slides. So same thing kind of with sugar. Our body, once we consume it, it does the same thing to our blood pressure. So Himalayan pink salt, black salts, they still at the end of the day water's attracted to them and they're going to increase our blood volume and increase our blood pressure. So I know some of those fancier salts might be used in certain recipes for something, and you just might want to use them less frequently, and just working on using less salt in general. But when it comes to when it's actually in our body, it does the exact same thing as regular table salt or kosher salt or anything. That's a good question.
Definitely. I see a few different questions related to um, fish. Maybe if you just want to speak a little bit about nutrition considerations with fish in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think so fish does have like we mentioned, all cholesterol comes from animal products. So fish has cholesterol, but it's very low in saturated fat. So it's a healthy option. And I have it listed here as it can be a heart healthy option too, depending on the type of fish. So fattier fish that come from like cold water, so like salmon or tuna, things like that, they have a lot of omega-3 fatty acids, and that's a fat that we have to get from our diet. We can't make it. So, trying to include those sorts of those type of fish can be beneficial to our health for a lot of reasons. And in general, if you're looking to add in more seafood, aiming for about 2 times a week is a good amount to have, and always just trying to choose fish that's low in mercury too. So tuna, salmon, having those are going to be good through omega-3s, and then no more than maybe like twice a week would be a good amount to get all the omega-3s that you need from your diet. But they also, it doesn't have to be fish to get those items. So I have listed chia seeds; those are a good source of omega-3s. Walnuts are a very good source, so you don't have to get it from fish. It's just that's the best source, like has the most.
And this is another question about some other foods. Is quinoa better than brown rice, or could you talk about those foods?
Yeah, so they're both considered whole grains. So, I don't think it's fair to say one's better than the other. I think they both can be a part of, a healthy whole grain to have. Quinoa does have a little bit of protein added to it too, so that's a plus. But if, brown rice also is a really good source of fiber as well. So, I wouldn't say one's better than the other. I just think they both are good foods to have in your diet. Maybe depending on the recipe you're having, that works better, but yeah, they're both good options for fiber. Yeah.
Awesome. And I see Matt shared in the chat a resource about finding good sources for seafood, and we also send fish and other types of seafood regularly as part of our meal plans for our home delivered meals and groceries. So there can be a lot of nutritional benefits for including those foods in your diet. Good source of a lot of these nutrients that we're talking about. Let's see. I'm just kind of scrolling through the chat for any other questions, and I know we have a lot of great comments as well. So for anyone attending, you know, feel free to take a look through the comments in the chat too. Everyone's sharing some interesting insights. And let's see, just taking another look through the chat. And again, your Food and Friends dietitian is a great person to follow up with after this for kind of questions about your individual needs, perhaps specific vitamins or nutrients, or questions about your medications or other health conditions. But otherwise, I think we got to most of the questions that we had here. Ashley, any final words to leave us with before we kind of wrap up the webinar?
Yeah, I just want to say, if anyone was interested and wants to talk more, just call reach out to your dietitian here, and we can talk more in detail about your specific nutrition and how to make some of these recommendations work for you. So yeah, and then I know Grace did share the survey. Do you mind sharing it one more time, Grace, just so that it's at the bottom of the chat?
Thank you. Good call.
I know it can get lost with everything.
Yeah, we really appreciate how engaged everyone has been today, and we would love to hear your feedback, thoughts, and like any suggestions that you have for future webinar topics. It's all good stuff. Oh, I do see one other question here from April about washing fruits and vegetables. What's the best method for that?
Yeah, so you don't need any special soaps or cleansers. Probably the simplest way and just as effective is just rinsing them in cold running water. So that's all you need. I know there are some like specialty fruit soaps and things, and I think you can use those. I don't think there's a problem with it, but they're not necessary. Just cold running water is the best way to wash everything, and just kind of use your hands and kind of scrub. Some people like use a little veggie brush, but your fingers and your hands can help scrub any dirt or anything we want off there, just as good as say a soap from the store. Okay, so thanks everyone for doing the survey for us. We'd love to just know what feedback you have for webinars going forward, and feel free to reach out to us with any questions you might have later on. So thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording right now.